1. In actual production, plate butt overhead welding is mostly used for the welding production of longitudinal and circumferential overhead welding seams for small vessels or small diameter pipelines. This welding method can be welded outside the vessel and can also form welds inside. Let's look at this picture. The arc welding of the electrode at the overhead position is a method for the welder to look up at the weldment to weld. It can be said that it is the most difficult welding method, because in the whole welding process, the molten pool is suspended under the weldment. Since the molten pool hangs upside down under the weldment, the molten metal droplets and molten metal in the molten pool tend to flow down under the action of gravity, forming what we see now as the weld bead. Moreover, the back weld is also very prone to sag, which affects the weld formation. In order to control the size and temperature of the molten pool, reduce and prevent the liquid metal from flowing down. In addition to using smaller welding parameters, the arc blowing force of the electrode should be used to push the molten drop upwards. Our learning goals in this class are: 1. Understand the welding characteristics and application scope of the overhead welding position, and learn the basic operation skills of plate butt overhead welding. 2. Master the technical requirements and operation essentials of plate butt overhead welding. 3. Learn to formulate plate butt overhead welding assembly welding scheme. Can correctly select welding parameters. Below, we take the thickness of 10 mm and the material of Q235B steel plate as an example to explain the operation skills of face-up welding. Please read the workpiece pattern, complete the welding task, and meet the technical requirements of the workpiece pattern. Our welding operation is divided into 3 layers: base layer, filler layer and cover layer. Please follow along with my video to learn. 1. Assembly and welding. Place 2 sets of qualified welding test plates on the welding tooling assembly platform, and keep the 2 test plates at the same level. Use both ends of the electrode to assemble the groove gap. The assembly gap of the initial welding end is 3 mm, and the final welding end is 4 mm. The clamping angle between the electrode and the tongs is 120 degrees. The electrode model is E5015. The diameter is 3.2 mm, and the welding current is 110 to 120 amperes. When spot fixing welding is performed on both ends of the back of the test plate, and arc welding is adopted. The spot fixing weld and the edge of the groove must be fully fused. The length of the spot welding seam is 5 to 10 mm at the beginning and 10 to 15 mm at the end. After the spot welding is completed, use a slag hammer and a wire brush to clean the surface of the tack weld to expose the metallic luster. The reverse deformation treatment is carried out by tapping the test plate, and the angle of the reverse deformation is 7 to 8 degrees. Use a welding rod or ruler to lay flat on the test plate, and measure the distance between it and the test plate to be 10 to 15 mm to ensure the anti-deformation of the test plate. After the reverse deformation is completed, the point-fixed weld is reinforced again on the inside of the groove. After reinforcement, the welds are cleaned, and finally the assembly points are ground and formed to facilitate joints. Check the reserved gap. Check the amount of anti-deformation, and the amount of anti-deformation is required to be 7 to 8 degrees. Check the amount of wrong side. The amount of wrong side is not more than 0.5 millimeters. This is the front side of the test board and the back side of the test board that have passed the inspection after assembly. 2. Bottom layer welding. Place the assembled test plate on the welding tooling platform, and the height shall be subject to the operating height of the operator to ensure that the welding seam is in the overhead welding position. The welding current is 115 to 125 amperes. The angle between the electrode and the tongs is 150 to 180 degrees. The angle between the electrode and the test plate is 90 degrees, and the direction of the molten pool is 90 to 110 degrees. Start the arc at the positioning point. After igniting the arc, melt the positioning point in the root of the groove to form the first molten pool. Welding. When the arc breaking method is used for welding, the arc breaking frequency is 50 to 60 times per minute. The arc should be lowered, and the electrode should go to the top of the groove root. Pay attention to observe the size of the molten pool and the molten hole. The latter solder joint should cover 2/3 of the previous solder joint. In this way, a weld is formed. When the joint operation is performed, the electrode should stay at the arc crater for a while, and then press the electrode to the root of the groove. When the sound of pop is heard, it proves that the back of the groove has penetrated, and it can be transferred to normal welding. When welding is received at the tail position, the arc should be depressed, and the arc crater should be filled up by repeatedly breaking the arc. After welding, clean the weld bead with a slag hammer and wire brush. This is the front and back of the weld completed after backing welding. 3. Filling layer welding. The welding current is 120 to 130 amperes. And the angle between the electrode and the welding tongs is 150 to 180 degrees. There are zigzag and crescent shapes for the transportation method of overhead welding. When filling the first layer of weld bead, the electrode swings from side to side and stops on both sides of the groove to ensure sufficient fusion. When performing the joint operation, ignite the arc at 10 mm behind the arc crater, pull it to the arc crater position for a while, and then transfer to normal welding after filling the arc crater. At the welding tail position, the arc should be lowered, and the arc crater should be filled up by repeated arc breaking. The soldering method of the second layer of filling is the same as that of the first layer of filling. Note that the filling layer must not be higher than the base metal, 1 to 2 mm from the surface of the steel plate, leaving a certain margin for the capping layer. After the filler layer is welded, clean the weld with a slag hammer and wire brush. This is the weld after filler welding is complete. 4. The cover layer welding. The welding current is 110 to 120 amperes. And the angle between the electrode and the welding tongs is 150 to 180 degrees. Use short arc and zigzag strip method in cover welding. Pay attention to sufficient fusion on both sides of the groove to ensure uniform welding speed. When transporting the strip to both sides of the groove, be careful to lower the arc and stop for a while. The edge of the molten pool just melts to the edge of the groove. When the strip is transported to the middle of the groove, The swing should be faster to prevent the weld bead from being super high in the middle of the weld. During the joint operation, the electrode ignites the arc from about 10 mm in front of the crater and is quickly pulled to the crater. Swing around the edge of the crater to fill the crater and start normal welding. When the welding reaches the end position, the arc should be lowered, and the arc crater should be filled by repeatedly breaking the arc. Clean the weld surface clean. This is the front side of the weld seam and the back side of the weld seam after the plate butt welding is completed. Through the operation video just now, the main problem of the butt welding of the welding rod and the arc welding plate has been solved. The main operation skills are: 1. Arc breaking welding is required for the bottom layer. You must hear the pop sound before you can switch to the normal welding to prevent subsidence. 2. The frequency of arc breaking is 50 to 60 times per minute. The arc should be lowered. The welding rod should go to the root of the groove, and the latter welding point should cover 2/3 of the previous welding point. A welding seam. 3. Ignite the arc at 10 mm behind the arc crater during the joint operation, and pull it to the arc crater for a short stop. 4. Use the straight line and crescent swing method to transport the bar. And the arc blowing force of the electrode should be used to blow the arc. When the droplet is pushed 5 at the welding tail position, the arc should be depressed. And the arc crater should be filled by the method of repeated arc breaking. That's all for this class. Thank you for watching.